They thought removing Emily Carter's name from the company would erase her value, but by Monday morning, the clients had already started leaving. At 7:12 on a Thursday evening, Emily stood in the marble lobby of Carter and Vale Strategy with a cardboard box pressed against her hip and the taste of cold coffee still bitter on her tongue. The building security guard, a kind man named Paul who had once helped her carry 50 pounds of presentation boards up to the 18th floor during a snowstorm, could not meet her eyes as he held out his hand for her access card. Behind him, the glass turnstiles glowed blue and silver, clean and expensive and indifferent. Everything in that lobby looked exactly as Emily had designed it 9 years earlier, from the brushed steel directory to the low white orchids on the reception desk, and yet suddenly it felt like a place she had only been allowed to visit. Her name was still etched on the wall upstairs, or at least it had been that morning. Carter and Vale. Carter first, because in the beginning, Daniel had insisted it sounded stronger that way. Back then, he had kissed her forehead in their one-bedroom apartment in Cambridge and told her she was the mind of the company while he was only the mouthpiece. Funny how men remembered poetry until lawyers entered the room. 2 hours earlier, Daniel Vale had sat at the head of the conference table in a charcoal suit Emily had chosen for him, his expression arranged into something solemn and reasonable, as if he were announcing a necessary restructuring instead of cutting his ex-wife out of the business she had built with sleepless nights and unpaid invoices. Beside him sat Vanessa Blake, 29, polished, composed, and already resting one manicured hand on the arm of the chair that had belonged to Emily for almost a decade. The company attorney used words like transition, alignment, market confidence, and leadership clarity, soft corporate pillows placed carefully over the face of betrayal. Nobody raised their voice. That was the cruelest part. It was all so civilized. Emily had listened while Daniel explained that the board believed her continued presence created confusion for clients after the divorce. He said it gently, almost sadly, performing decency for the room. Vanessa looked at Emily with a small sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. By the time the papers slid across the table, Emily already knew her email had been locked, her calendar wiped, her assistant reassigned, her office cleared of anything they considered company property. In the box now were the things they had allowed her to keep: a cracked ceramic mug, a small jade plant, 3 framed thank you notes from clients, and the black notebook Daniel had never bothered to open because he had always confused attention with administration. Emily shifted the box in her arms as the elevator doors closed behind her for the last time. Upstairs, on the 18th floor, Daniel and Vanessa were probably pouring champagne into the thin crystal flutes reserved for client celebrations. Down here, the October rain tapped against the front windows like impatient fingers. Paul cleared his throat and said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter." She almost corrected him. She had not been Mrs. Vale for 18 months. But Carter was hers again, reclaimed slowly, like a room after a long illness, so she only nodded. "It's all right, Paul." He knew it was not. She knew he knew. The absurd theater of workplace cruelty required everyone to pretend the props were harmless. Emily stepped outside into the Boston evening, where the wind came sharp off the harbor and slipped under the collar of her camel coat. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket, but she did not look at it. Not yet. She stood beneath the awning, watching her reflection tremble in the rain-dark glass. White woman, 38 years old, tired eyes, steady mouth, no title, no office, no company car waiting at the curb. For one terrible second, she felt the old panic rising, the one Daniel had trained into her with years of small corrections and public praise that somehow always left her invisible. Then she thought of every client whose crisis she had answered after midnight, every founder whose trembling voice she had calmed before a board meeting, every handwritten note in that black notebook. Daniel had the logo. Daniel had the lease. Daniel had the conference table, the press contacts, the receptionist, the passwords, the polished story. But Emily had something he had never learned to value because it could not be framed on a wall or announced in a quarterly update. She had trust. And trust, unlike ownership paperwork, had a way of walking out quietly. Before Carter and Vale Strategy had glass walls, private conference rooms, and a receptionist who pronounced the company name like it belonged on the side of a museum. It had been 2 folding desks wedged into the corner of a 700-square-foot apartment in Cambridge, a coffee maker that burned everything it touched, and Emily sitting cross-legged on the floor at 2 in the morning, building client decks while Daniel practiced investor pitches in the bathroom mirror. 9 years earlier, she had believed exhaustion was just the price of building something real. The apartment smelled constantly of printer ink, takeout noodles, and winter coats drying over the radiator. Daniel had energy then, the kind that filled a room before he entered it. He could make a stranger believe in an idea with 3 sentences and a smile. Emily admired that once. She thought charisma was a kind of courage. She did not yet understand that sometimes it was only a beautiful curtain hung over an empty stage. What Daniel sold, Emily had to make true. He promised strategy, but she built the research models. He promised brand transformation, but she spent Sundays reading customer reviews, annual reports, market studies, and handwritten complaint cards until her eyes ached. He promised clients that Carter and Vale would understand their business like family. Emily was the one who remembered that Margaret Whitmore hated the phrase luxury hospitality because her first hotel had been built from her father's old fishing lodge in Maine. Emily was the one who knew that the founder of Bellamy Skincare always went quiet before board presentations because her first investor had once laughed at her accent. Emily remembered birthdays, product launch anniversaries, restaurant preferences, children's names, old wounds, private fears. Daniel called those details charming. Clients called them the reason they stayed. In the early years, he praised her for it when no one important was listening. "You are the reason this works, Em," he would say, rubbing her shoulders while she revised another proposal past midnight. But praise given in private and erased in public is not love. It is a receipt someone never plans to honor. The first time Emily noticed the pattern was at a small business luncheon in Back Bay, when Daniel accepted an award for a campaign she had designed almost entirely alone. He stood beneath warm chandelier light, one hand resting over his heart, and thanked his brilliant team for supporting his vision. His vision. Emily sat at table 12 with a polite smile drying on her face like paint. Later, when she mentioned it in the car, Daniel laughed softly and told her not to be sensitive. "Investors like a clear leader," he said. "Clients like confidence. You know how these rooms work." And she did. That was the problem. She knew exactly how rooms worked. She knew how women could pour concrete under a building and still be introduced as decoration when the ribbon was cut. By the 5th year, Carter and Vale had moved to the 18th floor near Seaport Boulevard. Daniel's photograph appeared in business magazines. Emily's calendar swallowed her life. She handled the difficult calls, the wounded clients, the emergencies that arrived on Friday evenings when everyone else had already left for dinner reservations. Daniel handled panels, podcasts, and champagne breakfasts where he said words like legacy and disruption with the religious seriousness of a man who had never reconciled an invoice at midnight. Then Vanessa Blake arrived as a communications consultant with bright ambition, smooth confidence, and an instinct for finding the most powerful person in any room. She laughed at Daniel's jokes before he finished them. She called him visionary in front of the staff. She never asked Emily how the company actually functioned. At first, Emily blamed herself for noticing. Then she found her project notes rewritten under Vanessa's name, her client language folded into Daniel's keynote, her careful work polished into someone else's spotlight. By the time the marriage began to crack, the company had already taught Daniel how easy it was to take from Emily and call it leadership. That Thursday night, standing outside in the rain with the box in her arms, Emily understood something with a clarity so cold it almost steadied her. Daniel had not suddenly betrayed her in a conference room. He had been rehearsing for years. The rain followed Emily home that night in silver lines across the windshield, blurring Boston into streaks of brake lights, brick storefronts, and office windows where other people were still pretending ambition did not cost them pieces of themselves. Her apartment in Brookline was only 6 miles from the Seaport building, but the drive felt longer than the distance between her old life and the one waiting on the other side of that locked access card. She parked behind the brownstone, carried the box upstairs, and set it on her kitchen table with the careful gentleness people use around things that have survived a fall. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the radiator warming itself awake. It was smaller than the house she and Daniel had once owned in Newton, smaller than the corner office he had kept, smaller than the version of her life other people believed she should mourn. But every object in it belonged to her. The chipped blue bowl near the sink, the thrifted lamp beside the sofa, The framed print from a local artist Daniel had once called too sentimental. After the divorce, Emily had learned that peace often arrived without marble countertops or vaulted ceilings. Sometimes it looked like paying your own electric bill and sleeping through the night without someone sighing beside you, as if your breathing had become an inconvenience. She took the cracked mug from the box and turned it slowly in her hands. Carter and Vale Strategy, First Client Win, 2015. The lettering had faded from years of dishwashers, late nights, and Emily carrying it from meeting to meeting like a small ceramic witness. Their first client had been a family-owned bakery chain in Vermont that wanted to expand without losing the feeling of walking into a place where someone remembered your name. Daniel had wanted to reposition them as an artisanal lifestyle brand. Emily had spent 3 weekends driving through snow to visit their shops, talking with shift managers, delivery drivers, and customers who still bought cinnamon rolls by the dozen for church breakfasts. Her recommendation had saved the account, doubled the client's revenue within 18 months, and became Daniel's favorite origin story at conferences. He always told it beautifully. He simply forgot to mention she was the one who had done it. Back then, Emily had corrected him in private, then stopped correcting him because each conversation ended with Daniel leaning back, tired and wounded, asking why she needed credit so badly when they were on the same team. That phrase had trapped her for years. Same team. It made her feel selfish for wanting her own name attached to her own work. It made every quiet resentment look like disloyalty. Vanessa understood the value of that phrase immediately. She never challenged Daniel's version of history. She polished it. She took his stories and made them sharper, more heroic, easier to sell. Under her guidance, Daniel became not only founder and chief executive officer, but the visionary architect of the company's client-centered philosophy. Emily read that phrase in a magazine profile while sitting at her desk at 11:30 at night, surrounded by client notes and cold Thai food, and felt something inside her go still. Client-centered philosophy. Those were her words. Her philosophy. Her years of listening, recording, remembering, repairing. Daniel had not stolen it loudly. That would have been easier to name. He had absorbed it, repeated it, smiled over it, and waited for the world to applaud the sound of her thoughts in his voice. The marriage did not end in one dramatic scene. It thinned. First in meetings, where he interrupted her with a hand raised halfway, as if calming an overexcited intern. Then at dinners, where he checked his phone while she spoke and came alive only when Vanessa's name lit up the screen. Then at home, where he stopped asking about her day because, in his mind, her day was simply an extension of his. Emily remembered one winter evening when she found him in the kitchen rehearsing a keynote Vanessa had written from Emily's strategic framework. She pointed to a paragraph and said, "That came from my retention model." Daniel did not deny it. He smiled with the exhausted patience of a man correcting a child's misunderstanding. "Emily," he said, "ideas evolve. We are building something bigger than ego." She had stood there in wool socks on the cold tile, realizing that the man who once called her the mind of the company now considered her memory a threat. That was when she began keeping the black notebook close. Not because she planned revenge. Revenge still seemed vulgar to her then, something loud people did when they had run out of dignity. She kept it because she needed one place where reality remained intact. Client histories, promises made, fears disclosed, patterns noticed, mistakes Daniel never admitted, solutions she had built before anyone else knew there was a problem. Page after page, in her narrow blue handwriting, she preserved the company beneath the company. Now, alone in her kitchen, she opened that notebook and saw Margaret Whitmore's name on the first page she turned to. Preferred calls before 9 in the morning. Hates generic luxury language. Worried her hotels will lose soul after expansion. Values handwritten follow-up. Emily ran her thumb over the ink. Then her phone buzzed again from inside her coat pocket. This time, she looked. One new email. Subject line, checking in. Sender, Margaret Whitmore. Emily stared at Margaret Whitmore's email as if it might vanish if she breathed too hard. The subject line was ordinary enough, 2 harmless words glowing on the screen, but after the day she had endured, ordinary kindness felt almost dangerous. She set the mug down, wiped rainwater from her wrist with the edge of her sleeve, and opened the message. Dear Emily, I heard there has been a leadership change at Carter & Vale. I do not know what version of the story I am supposed to be hearing, and frankly, I am too old to enjoy corporate theater. What I need to know is simple. Are you still advising clients independently? The words landed with a quiet force that made Emily sit down before her knees decided the matter for her. Margaret had always written like she spoke, precise, unsentimental, and impossible to distract with polished nonsense. She owned 7 boutique hotels across New England, each one restored from some forgotten place with history in its walls. An old captain's house in Kennebunkport, a converted textile mill in Providence, a lakeside inn in Vermont where the floors creaked like they were keeping secrets. Daniel had once called her brand charming but limited. Emily had called it intimate, regional, and emotionally defensible, which made Margaret laugh for nearly a full minute during their first meeting. That laugh had been the beginning of a trust Daniel later took credit for in 3 separate interviews. Emily read the email again, then a third time. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, trembling not from fear exactly, but from the strange terror of being seen after years of being edited out. She wanted to answer immediately. She also heard Daniel's voice in her memory, calm and legalistic, warning her about non-solicitation clauses, transition terms, professional boundaries. Even absent, he knew how to occupy a room. Emily opened the folder of documents she had brought home from the meeting and skimmed the agreement again, her eyes moving past phrases designed to intimidate rather than illuminate. She could not contact Carter and Vail clients first. That much was clear. But Margaret had contacted her. There it was, the tiny door the truth had opened for itself. Emily drafted 3 responses and deleted all of them. The first sounded too wounded. The second sounded too defensive. The third sounded like Daniel had edited it. Finally, she wrote one sentence. I am available for independent advisory work, and I would be honored to speak if you believe I can be useful. She stared at the word honored, wondering if it was too much, then left it there because it was true. She pressed send at 9:43 in the evening. The apartment returned to silence. Outside, tires whispered through wet streets. Somewhere downstairs, a dog barked once and gave up, as if even the dog understood that Thursday had done enough damage. Emily changed out of her damp clothes, made chamomile tea she forgot to drink, and sat on the floor beside the box from the office. One by one, she removed the framed thank you notes. The first was from Bellamy Skincare, written after Emily helped them survive a failed product launch without blaming their customers. The second was from Whitmore House Hotels, after Emily convinced Margaret not to erase the old family photographs from the lobbies because guests did not want perfection, they wanted memory. The third was from a nonprofit in South Boston whose executive director had cried in the restroom before a donor presentation until Emily found her, handed her tissues, and rebuilt the opening speech on the back of a lunch menu. Daniel had never understood why clients sent notes to Emily and not to him. He thought gratitude should follow authority. Emily had learned it followed relief. At 10:18, her phone buzzed again. Margaret had replied, Monday morning, 8 o'clock. My office in Portland, or video if you prefer. And Emily, for what it is worth, I signed with Carter and Vail because of you, not because of the name on the door. Emily covered her mouth with one hand, not to stop a sob, but to contain the sudden, unbearable warmth that rose in her chest. She had expected the first night after losing the company to feel like an ending. Instead, it felt like a match struck in a dark room. Small, fragile, enough to see by. By Monday morning, the 18th floor of Carter and Vail Strategy looked exactly the way Daniel wanted it to look, which was always the first warning sign. The reception orchids had been replaced over the weekend with taller white arrangements that made the lobby feel less welcoming and more expensive, the kind of expensive that asked people to lower their voices before it asked them what they needed. Vanessa had ordered new nameplates for the conference rooms, all brushed brass and sharp edges, and Daniel's office door now carried the title Chief Executive Officer in letters large enough to reassure anyone who needed reassuring. At 8 o'clock, he stood before the staff with Vanessa at his side and spoke about evolution, focus, and a more ambitious future. He did not say Emily's name until someone from client services asked who would be handling Whitmore House Hotels. Even then, Daniel smiled as if the question were quaint. The accounts belong to the firm, he said. Clients trust stability. People nodded because people in offices often nod when a powerful man says something fragile with confidence. Across the room, Julia Bennett, Emily's former assistant, looked down at her notebook and wrote nothing. She had spent 4 years watching Emily turn client panic into calm, watching her take calls from airports, grocery store parking lots, and once from a dentist's waiting room with gauze still tucked inside her cheek. Stability had never been the brass letters on Daniel's door. Stability had been Emily answering the phone. By 9:15, the first strange thing happened. Margaret Whitmore's office canceled a strategy call scheduled for Wednesday and requested that all materials be paused until further notice. Daniel forwarded the email to Vanessa with a single question mark, as if punctuation could make reality less irritating. Vanessa replied within 2 minutes. She is testing us. Send warmth. Daniel sent warmth in the form of a polished note about continuity, leadership, and the full strength of the Carter and Vale team. Margaret did not answer. At 10:30, Bellamy Skincare postponed its quarterly renewal discussion. At 11, the South Boston nonprofit asked for copies of all historical campaign notes. By lunch, 2 restaurant clients had moved meetings from confirmed to tentative, the quiet corporate word for no one wants to explain the truth yet. Daniel kept his office door open at first, then half closed, then fully closed. Through the glass wall, the staff could see him pacing with his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand moving in clipped, impatient gestures. Vanessa sat at the conference table reviewing client files as if the right answer might appear if she stared hard enough at Emily's old folders. The problem was that Emily's work had never lived completely in folders. It lived in remembered hesitations, in the extra second before a founder agreed to. Something they secretly feared, in the difference between a client saying fine and meaning absolutely not. It lived in the black notebook now sitting on Emily's kitchen table beside a cup of coffee she had reheated twice and still forgotten to drink. Emily had spent Monday morning on a video call with Margaret, who appeared from her Portland office wearing a navy sweater and the expression of a woman who had survived enough boardrooms to know when a story had been varnished. Margaret did not ask Emily to gossip. She did not ask for divorce details or hallway drama. She asked about her hotel expansion, about whether the brand architecture still made sense after the Vermont property delay, about how to reassure longtime guests that growth would not turn memory into merchandise. Emily answered carefully, legally, and honestly. She did not mention Daniel once. She did not need to. When the call ended, Margaret leaned closer to the camera and said, "I have worked with firms, Emily. I have also worked with people. There is a difference." Afterward, Emily sat very still, letting the sentence settle into the small apartment like sunlight finding a floorboard. She had no office, no staff, no website, no letterhead. But by 2 o'clock, she had 3 more emails from former clients, each written with the same careful restraint, each asking some version of the same question. "Are you available independently?" Emily opened the black notebook, uncapped her favorite pen, and began a new page. Not revenge, not even victory, just names, needs, promises, and the first quiet outline of a life that Daniel had not approved, branded, or taken credit for. At Carter and Vale, Tuesday arrived dressed as Control. Daniel had always believed that the right suit, the right lighting, and the right sentence could bend a room back into obedience. So he called an emergency client retention meeting at 7:30 in the morning, before the staff had finished their first coffees and before the city outside the glass walls had fully shaken itself awake. The conference room smelled of espresso, dry erase markers, and the faint chemical sharpness of newly polished wood. Vanessa stood beside the screen. With a presentation titled Stability Initiative, which sounded less like a plan and more like something a nervous government would announce before admitting the bridge was already cracked. Daniel sat at the head of the table, jaw tight, wedding ring absent, cufflinks perfect, his face arranged into confidence with the desperate craftsmanship of a man repairing a portrait while the house behind him burned. On the screen were the names of 12 priority accounts. 4 were marked at risk. 3 were marked unresponsive. 1, Whitmore House Hotels, had been moved to executive intervention, a phrase that made Julia Bennett press her lips together and look down at her lap. Everyone in that room knew what executive intervention meant. It meant Daniel wanted to call Margaret Whitmore personally and remind her how important she was after spending 6 years letting Emily remember it for him. Vanessa clicked to the next slide and began talking about narrative discipline. She said clients needed reassurance that the firm's intellectual property, methodology, and institutional memory remained intact. Institutional memory. Julia almost laughed, which would have been career-limiting and therefore socially unacceptable, because apparently honesty still required a permission slip in corporate America. Emily had been the institutional memory. Emily knew which client hated morning calls, which founder had a son applying to colleges in the fall, which chief financial officer needed numbers first and emotion later, which board chair mistrusted phrases like visionary, because the last visionary had lost him $3 million. Vanessa had the customer relationship management system. Emily had the relationships. Daniel leaned forward and asked for immediate outreach scripts. He wanted language that was firm, gracious, and subtly corrective, meaning he wanted the clients to feel foolish for caring who had actually done the work. By noon, the emails went out under his signature. By 1:30, the first reply came back from Bellamy Skincare. Thank you for the update. We are reviewing our advisory needs and will not be scheduling further work at this time. At 2:10, the South Boston nonprofit wrote that it would be pausing its engagement. At 3:40, a restaurant group in Rhode Island requested final billing and project archives. No anger, no accusations, just polished little exits, each one closing with professional courtesy, the business equivalent of leaving the dinner party early and taking your coat before anyone could ask why. Daniel read them in his office with the blinds half drawn while Vanessa stood near the window, arms folded. They are coordinating, she said. Daniel shook his head. No, clients do not coordinate unless someone leads them. He did not say Emily's name, but it entered the room anyway, invisible and inconvenient, like a truth with nowhere else to sit. Across town, Emily spent that same afternoon at a corner table inside the Boston Public Library, because her apartment suddenly felt too small for the number of decisions arriving in her inbox. Rain tapped lightly against the tall windows. Her laptop was open beside the black notebook, and the cracked mug sat to her right, filled with coffee from the library cafe that tasted vaguely burnt and beautifully earned. She had made herself a rule before answering any client. No bitterness, no gossip, no borrowed poison. Daniel had tried to reduce her to a problem people needed to manage. She would not help him by becoming messy enough to fit the story. So she answered each email with care. Yes, she could consult independently. Yes, she would respect existing agreements. Yes, she could help them think through transitions. No, she would not speak poorly of Carter and Vale. The restraint cost her more than she expected. There were sentences she wanted to write so badly her hands ached. She wanted to tell Bellamy that Daniel had forgotten the name of their flagship product twice. She wanted to tell the nonprofit that Vanessa had once called donor sensitivity a branding obstacle. She wanted to tell every client the whole ugly architecture of being erased. Instead, she gave them what she had always given them, clarity. At 4:15, Margaret called. No video this time, just her voice, dry and steady through the phone. Emily, I spoke with 2 people today who asked whether you were starting something of your own. Emily looked at the rain sliding down the library glass. I am thinking about it. Margaret made a small sound that might have been approval. Think faster. There are more of us than you realize. Emily closed her eyes, and for the first time since the guard had taken her access card, she let herself believe the door had not locked behind her. It had opened somewhere else. By Wednesday, Emily had learned that quiet did not mean small. Quiet could be an inbox filling before sunrise. Quiet could be a former client asking for a call without naming the storm both of them could hear in the background. Quiet could be Margaret Whitmore sending one sentence at 6:05 in the morning, I gave your personal email to 2 people who asked for it, and then pretending that was not the business equivalent of opening a gate. Emily read it at her kitchen table with wet hair, a gray sweater, and a bowl of oatmeal going cold beside her laptop. Outside, Brookline was waking under a pale autumn sky, all school buses, dog walkers, and maple leaves stuck to damp sidewalks. Inside, her apartment had become something between a command center and a confessional. The black notebook lay open beside a legal pad filled with names, dates, boundaries, and careful reminders to herself. Do not contact first. Do not speak from anger. Do not confuse urgency with fear. She had written that last line twice because fear had a talented way of dressing itself as professionalism. By 8:30, she was on a video call with Bellamy Skincare. By 9:45, she was speaking with the South Boston nonprofit. By 11, The Rhode Island Restaurant Group had asked whether she could advise them through a brand refresh independently once their existing contract ended. Every conversation began with caution and ended with relief. No one wanted gossip. They wanted the woman who remembered what they had built before a consulting firm taught them to package it. Emily did not flatter them. She listened. She asked the same precise questions she had always asked. What are you afraid your customers will notice? What promise are you making that your operations cannot yet support? What part of the story still belongs to you? By noon, her legal pad looked less like a survival list and more like the first draft of a company. She hated how much that frightened her. Starting over sounded noble when other people said it from podiums. In real life, it meant choosing health insurance, estimating taxes, building a website, finding an office, and wondering whether the printer you bought on sale would betray you before your first client presentation. Human ambition was ridiculous that way, all shining speeches on the outside and toner cartridges on the inside. Emily made another cup of coffee and opened a blank document titled Northline Advisory. The name had come to her sometime after midnight. Northline, because a north line on a map did not beg for attention. It simply told you where you were. She typed her name beneath it, Emily Carter, founder and principal advisor, then stared at the words until they stopped looking like a costume. Across the city, Daniel was having a very different kind of morning. At Carter and Vale, the office had gone unnaturally bright. Every light switched on as if illumination could substitute for confidence. Vanessa had pulled the client services team into back-to-back meetings, demanding updated account histories, relationship maps, renewal probabilities, and personal details that Emily had never needed a database to remember. Daniel called Margaret twice. Both calls went to voicemail. He emailed Bellamy Skincare with a generous offer to reduce quarterly fees by 15%. The reply came 1 hour later. Our decision is not fee-based. That sentence sat on Daniel's screen like a locked door. He read it 3 times, then closed his laptop too hard, not enough to damage it, just enough to make everyone outside his office pretend they had not heard. Vanessa entered without knocking, carrying a stack of printed reports. We need to control the narrative, she said. Daniel looked up, his face pale beneath the office lighting. We need to keep the clients. Vanessa placed the reports on his desk. Then stop acting like this is emotional. It is operational. He almost laughed, because for years he had called Emily emotional whenever she understood something before he did. Now the clients were leaving for reasons his spreadsheets could not explain, and the woman he had dismissed as too attached had become the only person they trusted. By late afternoon, Emily found a small office listing online above a flower shop in Coolidge Corner. 480 square feet, second floor, exposed brick, street-facing windows, utilities included. The photos were plain, almost apologetic. A narrow room, old hardwood, 1 radiator, enough space for a desk, 2 chairs, a shelf, and perhaps a coffee maker that would not taste like burnt regret. She scheduled a viewing for Friday. Then she sat back and looked at the cracked Carter and Vale mug beside her laptop. For the first time, she did not see a relic. She saw proof. Something could be damaged and still hold what mattered. Friday came with a thin, clean sunlight that made Boston look briefly innocent, as if the city had not spent the week watching reputations crack behind glass walls. Emily arrived at Coolidge Corner 10 minutes early, because some habits survive betrayal with irritating loyalty, and stood outside the flower shop beneath the office listing, breathing in the sharp green scent of cut stems, wet leaves, and refrigerated roses. The shop owner, a woman named Mrs. Alvarez with silver hair pinned at the nape of her neck and reading glasses hanging from a chain, led Emily up a narrow staircase that groaned under every step like an old man asked to remember youth. The office was smaller than it had looked online, because real estate photography was apparently another branch of American fiction. 480 square feet, exposed brick on one wall, 2 tall windows overlooking Beacon Street, a radiator that clanked with theatrical importance, and a closet just large enough for a vacuum and regret. Emily loved it immediately, which frightened her. Love, in her experience, had often arrived wearing practical shoes and carrying hidden invoices. She walked to the window and looked down at the sidewalk, where people moved through the morning with coffees, strollers, tote bags, and the ordinary confidence of those not currently rebuilding their professional lives from legal ashes. There was no marble lobby here, no receptionist, No skyline view. No conference table long enough to make insecure people feel important. There was only light, brick, noise from the street, and enough room to begin. Mrs. Alvarez mentioned the rent, the included utilities, the month-to-month option, the fact that the previous tenant had been a therapist who moved to Maine after deciding people were too much work, a conclusion Emily found both alarming and understandable. Emily asked for 24 hours to think. Mrs. Alvarez smiled as if she had watched 100 women pretend to need time when they had already chosen. Take the weekend, she said. Rooms know who belongs in them. Emily almost laughed. Then she almost cried. Instead, she thanked her and walked back down into the flower shop, where a delivery driver was loading arrangements into a van and a little girl was pointing at sunflowers with the solemn authority of a tiny art critic. Her phone buzzed as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Another email. Then another. Bellamy Skincare wanted a proposal for a 90-day advisory engagement beginning after their contract expiration. The South Boston nonprofit asked whether she could review their donor messaging before the winter fundraising season. The Rhode Island Restaurant Group sent a note from its founder, who wrote, "We are not interested in being managed by people who never sat in our dining room." Emily stood there with cold air in her lungs and felt the week tilt. Not dramatically, not like a movie, more like a scale finding balance after years of being weighted on the wrong side. Across town, Daniel was discovering that discounts could not purchase devotion. Carter and Vale had offered reduced fees, extended service hours, complimentary workshops, and one humiliatingly desperate package Vanessa called the Founder Access Experience, which would have been funny if it had not been so sad. Clients responded with courtesy and distance. The firm's largest accounts were not storming out. They were doing something far worse for Daniel's ego. They were leaving politely. Politeness gave him nothing to fight. It offered no villain, no scandal, no emotional outburst he could point to as proof that Emily had poisoned the room. At 3 o'clock, he called an internal meeting and demanded a full analysis of relationship risk. Vanessa presented a chart showing that accounts with direct Emily involvement were the most vulnerable. Daniel stared at the slide, where her name appeared in small gray text beside declining revenue projections, and felt a heat rise under his collar. For years, he had treated Emily's presence as background infrastructure, like lighting, payroll, or office Wi-Fi. Necessary, invisible, only noticed when gone. Now the absence had numbers. By late afternoon, Julia Bennett closed her laptop, walked into the restroom, and typed a message from her personal phone. "I do not know what I am allowed to say, so I will only say this. People miss you here." Emily read it while sitting in her parked car outside the flower shop, the lease application folded on the passenger seat beside the black notebook. She typed back, "Thank you, Julia. Please protect yourself." Then she looked at the second-floor windows above the shop. The glass caught the setting sun and turned gold for a moment, making the little office look less like a risk and more like a promise pretending to be affordable commercial space. Emily picked up the application, uncapped her pen, and signed her name. By the following Monday, the second-floor office above the flower shop had become Northline Advisory in the same way a quiet woman becomes brave, not all at once, but by doing the next necessary thing until fear loses patience. Emily arrived at 7 in the morning with 2 grocery bags, a rented folding table, a refurbished laptop stand, a second-hand desk chair, and the cracked Carter and Vale mug wrapped in a dish towel like something fragile and sacred, which was ridiculous because it was only ceramic. But then again, people built religions around less practical objects. Mrs. Alvarez had left a small vase of yellow ranunculus on the windowsill with a note that read, "For the new beginning upstairs." Emily stood in the doorway for a full minute, breathing in the mingled scents of old brick, floor polish, coffee from the cafe next door, and flowers rising through the vents below. The radiator clanked once, approvingly or resentfully. It was hard to tell with radiators, and sunlight poured through the front windows in a pale gold sheet that made the empty room feel less like a risk and more like a witness. She had spent the weekend building the bones of the business. A simple website with no inflated promises, a clean invoice template, a professional email address, a one-page statement of services that did not use the words disruption, ecosystem, or visionary, because America had suffered enough. At the top of the page, beneath the name Northline Advisory, she had written one sentence: Strategy for companies that still believe trust is an asset. It sounded almost too plain. Then she remembered how many fortunes had been lost by men allergic to plain truth, and she kept it. Her first appointment was at 9. Margaret Whitmore arrived 5 minutes early, carrying a leather tote and wearing a camel coat that looked expensive because it did not need anyone to notice. She climbed the stairs without complaint, paused at the threshold, and looked around the small office with the calm assessment of a woman who knew the difference between size and substance. Emily suddenly saw the room through Margaret's eyes. Folding table, mismatched chairs, printer still in its box, one plant, one mug, no receptionist, no polished conference room, no skyline view to soften the terror of beginning again. Her face warmed. "I know it is not much yet," she said. Margaret removed her gloves slowly and gave her the kind of look only older women who have survived foolish men and bad lighting can give. "Emily," she said, "I have watched million-dollar firms hide bad judgment behind Italian marble. This is fine." Emily laughed before she could stop herself, and the sound startled her with its honesty. They worked for 2 hours. Not performed. Not presented. Worked. Margaret spread hotel occupancy reports across the folding table, while Emily opened the black notebook and moved through the expansion problem with the patience of someone untangling a necklace instead of cutting the chain. They discussed seasonal revenue, guest loyalty, staffing strain, and the emotional danger of making every property look identical in the name of efficiency. Margaret took notes. Emily took more. At 11:15, the bell from the flower shop door chimed faintly below, and Emily looked up to see 2 people standing at the top of the stairs. Lena Ortiz from Bellamy Skincare and Marcus Reed from the South Boston nonprofit, both holding coffee trays with the awkward dignity of people pretending they had not coordinated their arrival. Margaret turned in her chair and smiled as if this were exactly what she had expected. "We brought coffee," Lena said. "And contracts," Marcus added, lifting a folder. Emily stared at them, caught between gratitude and disbelief, feeling the room tilt again, not from fear this time, but from the strange weight of being trusted openly. No one had announced loyalty. No one had staged a dramatic departure. They had simply come where the work was. By noon, the folding table was crowded with papers, coffee cups, legal pads, and 4 people speaking over one another in the warm, practical rhythm of problems being solved. Downstairs, Mrs. Alvarez sent up a plate of cookies because apparently even capitalism became less offensive when fed properly. Emily placed the cracked mug beside her laptop, its faded old logo turned away from the room. For years, she had mistaken being needed in secret for being valued. Now clients sat in her unfinished office, not because a contract trapped them, not because a brand name impressed them, but because they knew exactly who had been listening all along. The first week of Northline Advisory did not make headlines, which was exactly why it mattered. There was no launch party, no photographer, no champagne chilling in silver buckets, no LinkedIn post written in that strange corporate dialect where every sentence sounds like it has been held hostage by a branding consultant. There was only Emily, arriving before sunrise, climbing the narrow stairs above Mrs. Alvarez's flower shop with a tote bag full of folders, a laptop, and enough uncertainty to qualify as a second employee. Each morning, the office smelled faintly of roses, printer paper, old brick, and coffee from the cafe downstairs. A combination so ordinary it felt almost holy after years of Carter and Vale's expensive scent machines pumping cedar and citrus into the lobby like trust could be manufactured by the ounce. Emily bought 2 used chairs from a closing law office in Somerville, assembled a bookshelf with 1 missing screw, and spent 45 minutes arguing with a wireless printer that seemed personally offended by ambition. At 10 o'clock on Thursday, Bellamy Skincare signed a 90-day advisory agreement. At noon, the South Boston nonprofit followed. By Friday afternoon, Whitmore House Hotels had formally paused all remaining strategic work with Carter and Vale and retained Northline for the next phase of its expansion. Emily read the signed agreement 3 times, not because she doubted it, but because part of her still expected good news to apologize and leave. Margaret called 5 minutes later. "I assume you were sitting there quietly trying not to feel pleased," she said. Emily looked around the small office, at the sunlight on the brick, the crooked shelf, the cracked mug beside her laptop. "Something like that." Margaret gave a dry laugh. "Try feeling pleased." It is not illegal in Massachusetts. Emily smiled, and for a few seconds, the smile did not have to prove anything to anyone. Across the city, Daniel was no longer smiling at all. Carter and Vale's weekly revenue report had arrived in his inbox that morning, and for the first time in years, the numbers did not behave like loyal subjects. Projected renewals were down 28%. 3 major accounts had paused. 2 had requested contract reviews. 1 had asked for historical documents related to work Emily had personally led, a phrase Daniel found irritating enough to forward to legal with no message attached, because apparently silence could be a tantrum if sent by email. Vanessa insisted the situation was manageable. She wore cream silk, red lipstick, and the calm expression of a person who had not yet realized she had inherited a house after the foundation had shifted. She proposed an industry statement announcing Carter and Vale's renewed commitment to client excellence under Daniel's leadership. Daniel approved it because desperate men often mistake more words for more control. The statement went out on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, it had become the quiet joke of 3 separate client Slack channels. Nobody mocked it publicly. That would have been useful to Daniel. Instead, clients responded with the soft, devastating language of professionals who had already made up their minds. We appreciate the update. We are evaluating our future needs. We will be in touch. The phrases were polite little doors closing one after another. Then Vanessa made the mistake that changed the temperature of the room. She sent a private note to several accounts suggesting that Emily's departure had been necessary to ensure a more scalable, less personality-dependent service model. The wording was clean. The insult was not. Lena Ortiz from Bellamy Skincare forwarded the message to Emily with only 1 line. Did they think we would not notice? Emily sat very still when she read it. Anger moved through her, bright and sharp, but beneath it was something steadier. She did not reply immediately. She opened the black notebook instead, turned to Bellamy's section, and found the page from their failed launch 2 years earlier, the one Daniel had wanted to reframe as a consumer education issue until Emily proved the packaging instructions were confusing customers. Emily remembered Lena crying in a parking garage after the board meeting, whispering that she was tired of being told the customer was wrong. Emily had listened then. She listened now. Her answer was brief. I am sorry you received that. I will not respond in kind. Let the work speak. By sunset, 3 clients had sent similar notes. Not complaints. Not demands. Evidence. Emily placed them in a folder titled Boundaries, because dignity, she had learned, was not silence. It was choosing exactly where to place the truth. 2 weeks later, Northline Advisory had acquired the one luxury Emily had not expected, a rhythm. Floorboards like a small daily announcement that the world, against all evidence, intended to continue. Emily would arrive with coffee in one hand and the black notebook in the other, climb the narrow stairs, open the front windows 2 inches, and let the sounds of Beacon Street enter the office before the emails did. The room still looked unfinished. The bookshelf leaned slightly to the left. The printer worked only when addressed with undeserved patience. One chair squeaked in a way that made serious conversations briefly less serious. But the work was real, and real work had a way of furnishing a room faster than money. By the end of the 2nd week, Emily had 5 active clients, 2 pending proposals, and 1 invitation that made her sit back from her laptop as if the screen had said something impolite. Harrington Hotels wanted Northline Advisory to participate in a competitive strategy pitch for its national repositioning project. Harrington was not boutique. Harrington was not quiet. Harrington owned 32 properties across the United States, from waterfront resorts in Florida to historic hotels in Chicago, Denver, and Charleston. The contract would be worth more than Northline's projected first-year revenue. It was the kind of account Daniel would have framed as destiny, and Vanessa would have converted into a press release before the ink dried. Emily read the invitation twice, then a 3rd time, because apparently terror preferred repetition. The final line explained that Carter and Vale Strategy had also been invited to present. There it was, tucked politely at the bottom, the past waiting in a conference room with catered coffee. For a moment, Emily was back in the 18th floor boardroom, watching Vanessa's hand rest on her chair, hearing Daniel say clients trust stability. Her body remembered before her mind could argue. Her shoulders tightened. Her throat went dry. The small office seemed suddenly too bright, too exposed, too easy to lose. Then Margaret Whitmore called, because older women with excellent timing were proof that civilization had not completely failed. "I assume you received Harrington's invitation," Margaret said. "I did. You sound like you swallowed a paperweight." Emily looked at the email glowing on her screen. "Carter and Vale is presenting too." Margaret was quiet for one beat, just long enough to let Emily hear how little that impressed her. "Then prepare better. That is usually the civilized alternative to panicking." Emily laughed softly, despite herself. "I do not know if I am ready for something that large." "No one is ready for the room that changes them," Margaret said, time before closing the file. On the morning of the pitch, Emily dressed in a navy suit she had bought on sale and had tailored with money she should probably have saved for accounting software. She placed the cracked mug on her desk, touched the black notebook once, and locked the office door behind her. Downstairs, Mrs. Alvarez looked up from trimming lilies. "Big meeting?" Emily nodded. "Big enough." Mrs. Alvarez handed her one yellow ranunculus wrapped in tissue. "For luck," she said. Emily tucked it carefully into her tote bag and stepped into the Boston morning, carrying no entourage, no borrowed confidence, and no illusion that the room would be kind. But she carried the work. For the first time in years, that felt like enough. The Harrington pitch took place on the 26th floor of a downtown Boston tower where the lobby smelled of polished stone, expensive coffee, and the particular anxiety of companies pretending decisions were made by logic alone. Emily arrived 15 minutes early and found Daniel already there. He stood near the reception desk in a dark suit, Vanessa beside him in ivory, both of them framed by the city through floor-to-ceiling windows, as if someone had arranged them for a magazine profile about ambition and its unfortunate side effects. Receptionist called them in. Between loyalty points and loyalty. System, in all its dramatic inefficiency, liked to keep old alarms installed long after the fire was out. But she no longer opened every promising email with the secret expectation that it would contain a correction, an apology, or some new proof that she had misunderstood her own worth. Northline had outgrown the folding table first, then the crooked bookshelf, then the single office above the flower shop that had once seemed impossibly brave. Emily did not move. Not yet. Instead, she leased the room next door when the accounting tutor retired, knocked through the shared wall with Mrs. Alvarez's permission, and created a second workspace with 2 desks, a round meeting table, and a shelf for client binders arranged by need rather than prestige. Julia Bennett joined in January, walking in on a cold Monday morning with a resignation letter still folded in her coat pocket and the dazed expression of someone who had finally stopped mistaking survival for loyalty. Emily did not ask for gossip from Carter and Vale. She asked what kind of coffee Julia liked and whether she preferred the desk near the window or the one closer to the radiator. Julia stared at her for a second, then laughed so suddenly she had to cover her face. At Carter and Vale, no one had asked her what she preferred in years. That was how Northline grew, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with small corrections to old cruelties. Clients were answered by people who knew their names. Junior staff were allowed to speak before the most expensive person in the room explained what everyone supposedly meant. Meetings ended with decisions, not fog machines disguised as strategy. Emily kept the black notebook on her desk, but she no longer clutched it like evidence in a trial. It had become less of a shield and more of a compass. From one dramatic mistake, they eroded where no one was listening. Daniel learned that too, though much later and with far less grace. Carter and Vale survived because companies with good lawyers and enough cash often do. Another cheerful reminder that capitalism has the moral sensitivity of a parking meter. But it shrank. The 18th floor office was replaced by a smaller space in the financial district. Vanessa left within 6 months for a larger firm, taking with her a portfolio of language that sounded impressive until examined under daylight. Daniel sent Emily one email after the Harrington win, brief and polished, congratulating her on the account and suggesting that perhaps there might be room for future collaboration. Emily read it once while standing beside the office window, snow beginning to fall over Beacon Street in soft, indifferent pieces. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel the old pull of needing him to admit what he had done. She felt only distance, clean and surprising. She answered the next morning. "Thank you, Daniel. I wish you well, but Northline will not be pursuing collaboration." It was the shortest message she had ever sent him, and somehow the most complete. In March, Harrington invited Emily to present early results at a hospitality leadership conference in Chicago. Opens when it knocks.